Welcome to the Green Parking Council webinar on EV access. This presentation is part of our continuing series of informational webinars on sustainable technologies and programs in parking facilities. I am Trevor Mead, Green Parking Council Staff Associate. If you encounter any technical problems during the presentation, please email Paul Wessel at paul@greenparkingcouncil.org or send a chat message in the box on the left-hand side of your screen. I'll now pass the presentation over to GPC Executive Director Paul Wessel for an introduction.
Thanks, Trevor. I'm really excited about this presentation today. This is really a transformative moment for what I've learned is called personal mobility. There are a wider, growing number of choices for ways for us to get around. Different fuel sources, we can own cars, lease cars, borrow cars, share cars, take Uber, we can own bikes, we can share bikes. And what's going on, I think, is that we're all trying to figure out sustainable models of sustainable mobility. And to do this, we've got to figure out a business model that works for growing the necessary infrastructure, whether we're a Canadian bike sharing company or a US EV infrastructure company. And as players trying to figure this out, questions come up about equal access, about open source standards, about control of data, about pricing, and these are all sort of swirling around us right now. And on EV infrastructure, it's especially interesting because the government's been funding the rollout of some of the infrastructure for very good reasons, and at the same time, it's trying to grapple with what are the policies that govern how this infrastructure should be rolled out. And with EV charging, it truly is a new market. This is nothing that we've ever seen before, with new challenges, new opportunities, and new rules to be developed. And some of these we can do collaboratively. Some will be done legislatively. Some will be done unilaterally, and some may be embedded in our choices of hardware. So today is really an exploration of that, and today's presenters have been at the front lines of emerging practices and policies about how we're going to charge electric vehicles as we transition over to newer, cleaner mobility technologies. So I'm excited to learn from the folks who are presenting today. Trevor will give you a little bit of detail on them, and get their advice and their wisdom as the rest of us try to figure out how to make our way in this new, more sustainable world. So Trevor, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, Paul. Today our focus will be educating parking facility owners and operators on the issue of EV interoperability. An understanding of this issue will help facility decision makers ensure the equipment they deploy allows for operational flexibility and is accessible to the greatest number of EV drivers. We will kick off with a 10-minute presentation from John Hollywell of the Electric Power Research Institute. John will walk us through the features charging stations utilize to achieve greater interoperability. Then we will hear from Richard Lowenthal of ChargePoint and Jay Friedland of Plug in America. Richard and Jay will discuss recent California legislation that grapples with the issue of EV interoperability and what implications this legislation could have nationwide. Please enter any questions into the chat box located on the left-hand side of your screen. We have 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to go through the questions we received during the presentation. We will also be live tweeting during the webinar, so please submit comments using the hashtag GPCWebinar. The webinar will run no longer than 1 hour. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's first presenter. John Hollywell is a Senior Project Manager in the Transportation Group of the Power Delivery and Utilization Sector of the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI. Mr. Hollywell's primary focus is smart charging and infrastructure development for plug-in electric vehicles. His other research activities focus on improving efficiency of power supply systems, solid-state lighting, and seeking new ways to deliver products and systems that optimize energy use. Hollywell joined EPRI in 2007. He has broad experience in design and application of electronic circuits and electronic systems in instrumentation, controls, embedded systems, and power supplies. Before joining EPRI, he worked at AGT, Vacuum Technology, and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Hollywell received Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in electrical engineering from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. He is a member of the IEEE and holds an extra class amateur radio license. John?
Thank you, Jay. I just want to make sure I'm unmuted.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Appreciate the invite today to talk with your group, and want to move into this pretty quickly, so we'll move on to the next slide here. I'm going to try and give you an overview of the key interfaces on charging equipment, focusing on 4 areas. There are obviously more nuances to this than I'll cover, but I just wanted to kind of approach it at a high level and talk about some of the implications of these 4 interfaces and how you implement those. 2 terms I'll use: EVSE, you should know that, electric vehicle supply equipment, and the electric vehicle service providers, and then RFID for the identifying yourself with plastic cards or dongles or those types of devices, just so you don't see an acronym you don't understand. EPRI is a not-for-profit company formed to do research in the public interest, and you can read our other attributes there. I actually work out of our office in Knoxville, Tennessee, but our major office is in Palo Alto, California, and we've been at this since 1973. So the first thing I wanted to look at was just give you an overview of the supply equipment. I think most of you, if you've looked at this industry at all, you may be familiar, but this is just showing you some of the options available. AC level 1 charging, where you just use an outlet. There are now some products in the market that have permanently attached cables that provide AC level 1 charging. AC level 2 at 208 volts or 240 volts up to 80 amps, and then DC level 2, which still most people seem to call it level 3, but technically from the Society of Automotive Engineers it's level 2. So I'm going to primarily focus on level 2, but what I'll talk about does apply as well to any public station, so just to kind of orient that. One of the things we view at EPRI is sort of the big picture of charging, and so when you look at the charging space, there's obviously some key places, residential being a very important location for charging. Vehicles spend most of their time in the residential setting, and that's probably the best place to charge them. Having said that, keep in mind that that includes multifamily, where apartment dwellers or those in high-rise buildings may have to use charging infrastructure that's much more like what we'll talk about today. So even for residential, beyond a certain number of consumers, if you want wide penetration of plug-in vehicles, you have to address how do you help people that live in multifamily dwellings provide charging for them. And you can see there's some different requirements in different places. Workplace has different considerations than say, a public station. The infrastructure I'll talk about could probably be used at workplace or public or in the multifamily setting. And again, we expect most charging to occur at home, whether that's home might be curbside near your apartment house or in a single-family dwelling in a garage or carport or driveway. So one of the things, I did a similar presentation to this last year at the California Energy Commission, and one of the major changes that was in the works last year, but I think is taking on a much stronger influence in what we'll talk about today, is activity within the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST. They are charged at the federal level to develop model language for vehicle fueling. And so they do these initially for things like gasoline vehicles or compressed natural gas or hydrogen fuel. They develop the standards that go into the code of federal regulations. And these standards are adopted at the state level. And the idea is that NIST does this to try and have uniform rules across the U.S. for how we sell fuel. And because plug-in vehicles are vehicles, NIST is charged with the same sort of requirements to develop language that regulates the sale of electricity as a vehicle fuel. So I've given you links in these slides here you can go look at. There are a couple handbooks that they put out. And it looks like I accidentally put the same number in those, but I believe the first link, document 1, is Handbook 130, Handbook 130. That's the device code requirements, and then Handbook 44. I may have those numbers flipped, but those will take you directly to the documents. The link above that will take you to the NIST website. This is important because they're discussing how you go about charging for fuel, sort of the logistics of sale of charging as in the public domain. And so I would highly encourage you to take a look at those documents. There are requirements about power measurement, time parameters, all sorts of things at the charge station, very much modeled on gas pumps. in terms of what we're used to seeing on a gas pump as we conduct a transaction, even to the point of requirement for receipts, which is kind of a heartburn issue because they typically want printed receipts, and that doesn't seem to fit very well with electric vehicle fueling. So that's an ongoing activity. Handbook 44 is still in draft form. Handbook 130 was adopted last year, and I believe actually gets published into the Code of Federal Regulations this month. But I know there's an effort in the industry to try and go back and revisit that document as well. So we'll kind of see where that goes. I think that's a very important topic if you're interested in what's coming in the future for public charging. So having said that, I want to focus on networked EVSEs, but always put out this caveat. Not all EVSEs need to be on a network, and you can imagine possibilities where a business or garage where you're providing charging free based on other reasons. Maybe you're trying to attract customers, those sorts of things. A facility that has a payment kiosk or a central location, a secure parking area where maybe you have a gate that a company employee badge will open a gate. Those may be cases where you don't need any fancy intelligence on an EVSE where it doesn't need to be networked. There are downsides to this. It means that the device is sort of there. It's not being monitored remotely. You may or may not have information about whether it's functioning properly. So there are some features you lose in not being on a network. I'll move pretty quickly here. I want to focus on these 4 interfaces. So the first one is where the consumer interacts with the charge station, numbered 1 here. Number 2, the network, which is the backhaul from the EVSE, the charge station, either to your EVSP, your service provider, or to your local network, or whatever is the controlling entity for that charge station. And we imagine that even now there are multiple EVSPs out there, and there may be also private networks that develop. And so these 4 interfaces sort of give you hooks into different aspects of the system. And we'll move to the next slide. So if you think about that first interface, that is the consumer interface. Right now there's a number of different means to authenticate yourself at a charge station. And you can read through that list. I think the key thing, 2 key things. One is there's a lot of variety here, and it may be confusing for consumers. And the second is that the NIST activity is probably going to have a major impact on this. They may drive this toward a requirement for credit cards, those sorts of things. We'll see where that goes, but keep that in mind. I won't dwell on this, but if you're interested, there's also the aspect of energy measurement for the vehicle charging session. And there are a number of activities going on in different organizations. This slide has links that you can go to, although I was not able to find a link to the ANSI work, but there is a contact name there. If you're interested, I would highly recommend you get involved in this Smart Grid Interactive Panel, I believe is what SGIP stands for. These are groups that NIST also sponsors, so, but kind of a sidelight activity. I won't dwell there. The last one is that keep in mind that there are activities underway in the Society of Automotive Engineers to develop standards that would allow you to directly control a vehicle. So that in those cases, you may have intelligence on the vehicle where that's where the consumer interacts. In addition, vehicles do have their own telematics system, so they already have communications enabled on board the vehicles. So when you look at the current state of things, the key interfaces for public charging, the bulk of these out in the field right now are proprietary. There's a little bit of change coming in that. I think our other speakers may address some of that, but for the most part right now these are proprietary, but there's certainly a lot of interest in moving away from that. The interface between different network providers, there's a group called Collaborative looking at that. We'll get in a little more detail as I go through these, but that is something that there's interest in working on as well, and that's where you get toward things like the ability to roam across networks. So when we look at that second interface, that is the backhaul, this is probably one of the critical ones for the parking industry view of this. I think that the main thing here is that when you purchase an EVSE, if it is tied to a specific network protocol, those are sort of married for life. If that's not an open standard, it's arguable that if there is an open standard right now, the closest one would be this Open Charge Alliance activity. It's not a perfect activity. It's kind of a work in progress. I think it's making good progress, but that's sort of where the industry is heading at this point. I'd be curious to hear the other speakers' comments on that. Just keep in mind, if you have a proprietary network, it means that when you choose a charge station, you have to pick a charge station that supports the network you're interested in, and that once you install that charge station, you have to rely on that network for your support. Kind of like a TV that only works on one cable company's protocol. The next interface there at number 3, the inter-network interface. So this would be, for example, between Blink's network and ChargePoint, allowing them to transact data between the networks so that if I belong to ChargePoint and I'm a member and have their card, that I could go to another branded station and seamlessly use that. It's a good idea to have this. It's typically done in the cloud now, server-based over public internet through the cloud. It works best if all the network providers participate. If somebody's an outlier not in the network, then they're obviously not going to be a part of this. The last one I want to touch on is this real-time information interface. This is one of the key advantages, I think, if you have networked infrastructure, is that you can get this real-time data. And ownership of that data and who can get to it, right now it's a little divided. Each of the EVSPs has websites, and they have maps where you can pull up their stations, but they typically only have their own branded locations. So there's an interest in trying to open that up and have a single map that provides information about all the stations. This doesn't help for stations that aren't on a network. And as time goes forward, the need for this probably diminishes more early in when drivers are new to EVs and they're a little more worried about infrastructure. This is probably pretty important to adoption. So we'll see how that progresses. I'm not going to dwell a lot on this. I just want to point out that some people do get confused between when we talk about a standard for the EVSE backhaul, like Open ChargePoint Protocol, or a clearinghouse activity like Collaborative, which is an organization looking at the inter-provider capability. They provide different functions. They're complementary, but I just wanted you to be able to look at this slide and you can kind of get an idea of what the difference in those two are. So primarily, OCPP is focused on getting data to and from the charge station itself, and Collaborative, or in Europe they have a group called HubJect, they're focusing on this inter-network interoperability, and I believe NEMA also has an activity looking at that. So I want to summarize, when you look at these interfaces, some of these focus on consumer convenience, so that how I interact with a charge station, how I get real-time map data, the ability to roam across networks, those are all things that just make this a better experience for consumers. And I think we always have to have that focus in this industry, because adopting one of these cars, it's a new technology, it's a little scary to trade over to having an all-electric or a plug-in vehicle. So nailing these consumer convenience interfaces is important. The interface number 2 is primarily focused again on site host flexibility. Whether you're tied to a network or not, can you choose different providers to operate your charge stations, or do you only have one choice? That's kind of where that interface comes in. And I added one other item here, which is, there may be a desire for you as a site host to have information about your network, and these networks provide that capability. So typically you're logging into an application at your network provider's website, where you can look up, say, the occupancy of your stations or statistics on them. So that's my full presentation. Hopefully I've covered some of the key interfaces, and we'll leave time at the end for questions. So thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Today's second presenter is Richard Lowenthal. Richard is the CTO of ChargePoint, which he co-founded in 2007. From 1998 until 2007, he was instrumental in starting several companies, including Lightera, Pipel Systems, and Procket Networks. From 1996 to 1997, Richard was Vice President and General Manager of Cisco's Wide Area Network Access Products Division. From 1990 through 1995, Richard was Vice President of Research and Development for Stratacom, a telecommunications equipment company. Prior to Stratacom, Richard was co-founder and Vice President of Engineering for Stardent Computers and Vice President of Engineering for Convergent Technologies. As a former mayor of Cupertino and actively involved in the nonprofit world, Richard keeps in touch and keeps it real for the people. He has a BS in electrical engineering from UC Berkeley. Richard?
Well, I hope you can hear me. Can
Yes,
you?
we can.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for having me here today, and I'm happy to present. Just a bit on our company. We are a player in the shared charging market, which includes public charging, workplace charging, and multifamily housing. So anywhere where people use more than one driver uses a charging station, and not so much in the home. Although we have thousands of stations in homes, that's not the focus of our business. We have about 15,000 stations out there in the shared charging market. We have 50,000 drivers that use our network today. We're located in Silicon Valley. Moving, let's see, to the next slide, see if I can work the controls. There we go. So I was asked to talk about some of the key laws and regulations and the history there and how this works. From the regulatory viewpoint, there's a little bit of redundancy here, so I'll move over those parts quickly. Kind of the essential law for our segment was Assembly Bill 631, which a policy that's been adopted, frankly, by several states. This is a regulation that says that if you offer charging services, it doesn't make you into a utility. So the way ChargePoint works, we have about 2,000 customers, and for us, a customer is somebody who offers charging services to others. So somebody like an employer, like Google, offers charging services to their employees. Cities offer charging services to their residents. Parking garages offer services to people who park there. All of those, without this law, would have been considered selling electricity, and you'd be under the regulation of the PUC. This law says, no, you're not under the regulation of the PUC. That doesn't mean you're off the hook, because indeed what that does is immediately throw you under the auspices of weights and measures. So there's always somebody there to regulate this business, and basically AB 631 made it clear that rather than the PUC, it's weights and measures and the NIST group that John talked about earlier. And we'll talk about how they do that in a moment. The next important bill is Senate Bill 454, also a California bill, but being widely copied in other states. This basically says that any driver should be able to use any public charging station that they find. So you don't have to be a member of a club or a group, or you don't have to be a ChargePoint subscriber or to use a station. You can walk up to a station and either by phone or using your smartphone or using a credit card, one way or another, anybody can use any public station. In addition, all of the public station providers have to provide directory information, which we send to a part of the DOE so that the stations can be found. Next important handbook we talked about, John talked about earlier, Handbook 130. This tells you the rules of engagement with the public. That is, how you can charge for charging, and I'll have a slide on talking about that. But these are things like, can you charge by kilowatt hour? Can you charge by time? All of that's regulated by Handbook 130. Handbook 130, you'll see it's a national guideline, but typically adopted by all states. Handbook 44 is similar to 130. It talks about the device. So it talks about what a public charging station needs to have in it. And finally, was mentioned is the NEMA interoperability rules. This is what's going to provide roaming for drivers, so that a driver can use any public charging station, and if they have a driver account, they only need one. So going into a little more detail, Handbook 130. So there's a group at NIST. It's a U.S. National Working Group for this industry, and we're setting the rules that you'll see when you encounter a charging station, and it will do things like tell you how much power you're going to get if you plug in, and how much it's going to cost to charge your car there. So these are the same kinds of rules, and Handbook 130 is the same thing that applies to a gasoline station that says how signage works and that you can only sell by gasoline by the gallon and whatnot. And basically where they have come out is that you can sell charging services by any combination of a price per kilowatt hour and a fee. So you could charge by time like a parking meter. You can charge by energy, or you can say, well, you're really both parking and getting energy. California is going in the direction of a combination, that every time you go to a charging station, you're actually getting some energy and paying for some energy and paying for parking for using that parking space. So that kind of thing is all regulated by Handbook 130. It is a proposal that comes from the Department of Commerce piece of that called NIST. It is typically adopted by each state's weights and measures group, which in California is part of Food and Agriculture. Handbook 44 is very similar, except it's talking about what you actually put on the equipment. So it's the labeling of how much power you're going to get, the labeling of how much you're going to pay, and how you're going to get your receipt for if you paid for charging, and go through the same kind of development at NIST and same adoption by weights and measures on a state-by-state basis. So Senate Bill 454, we talked about this already briefly, but you can have membership systems. You can be a member of a charging network, and you'll get some increased capabilities, but it can't be required. So anybody in the public should be able to go up to a charging station and charge their vehicle. That's the primary goal of this, and it's called the Open Access Law. And we all will send lists of our publicly available stations to NREL, part of DOE, so that information is available to the public. You have to disclose pricing, and also part of Senate Bill 454 was that we would have to develop a roaming scheme so that it didn't matter which sort of brand of charging station you went to, you'd be able to use them equally and just have one account. So this is similar to what you get with your ATM card, where you can go to the ATM machine at any bank and draw money out of the account at your bank. So we need to have a similar thing here. If somebody has a driver account somewhere, he should only need to have one, and then any station that he finds in the public should access that one account. So Collaborative was mentioned earlier. This is an organization that will connect all the charging service providers so that, for instance, if you charge at a Blink station, but your account is with ChargePoint, the money will come out of your ChargePoint account, and the money will be sent to the Blink network, just like an ATM card works. Or this shows also a station from GE, another one from Semiconnect. Whatever charging station you charge at, will access your home account for payment and other interoperability issues that between the various station networks. In addition, it will be able to produce a point of interest software interface. So if a automaker, for instance, needs to get a point of interest data, they can get it from Collaborative. And this is the details of that. There's basically what NEMA is doing is drawing up standards for interconnection between the charging networks so that all of that roaming business will work, and bills are reconciled, and whatever, for instance, bill you might have incurred by charging at a charging station is reflected back to your home network where your account is, and the money moves. So it's basically to make this roaming a reality. We have to have a set of software interfaces that the various networking companies use to communicate with each other. And that's on a timeline. It's not available today. The standards are being developed at NEMA, and they're expected to be all done by the end of this quarter, so that the charging network providers like Blink and ChargePoint and Semiconnect and OpConnect and CCGI can all develop software to those standards to make it easy for drivers to roam. And that's all I had. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Richard. Today's third and final presenter will be Jay Friedland. Jay is managing partner of Cinematic Partners Ltd., a consulting firm developing high-technology ventures. A self-described serial entrepreneur, he has built several companies as well as developed key industry alliances between companies both large and small. Jay is currently working with the new electric motorcycle startup Zero Motorcycles. His environmental activism began in the 1970s, and he is also president of the Central Coast Electric Audio Association. Jay is also the legislative director at Plug in America. Jay?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I think Richard actually did a great job of covering a bunch of my points, so I'll try and get through this fairly quickly so we can get to questions, because it looks like there's quite a lot of questions, and I think we'd really like to try and answer those. So really, we come at this from the perspective of the consumer, and what we want to try and achieve is, what do consumers really want when they look at moving their EVs, driving them, and then what do they want in terms of charging infrastructure. So a little tiny bit of background. First, who's Plug-in America? We have about 30,000 active supporters, and these are really current and future EV consumers. We helped drive more than $14 billion worth of EV funding as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, better known as the stimulus. So for those of you who have electric cars and gotten that $7,500 rebate or tax credit, you can thank us for that or helping make that happen. We spend a lot of time educating and influencing policymakers, really coming at it as an independent voice from consumers. And we do a lot of active advocacy using leverage of basically the fact that the drivers really care about a lot of issues. And then finally, we have hundreds of millions of miles on cars, and we have probably hundreds of thousands of charging sessions. And so we've really been there and we've really seen that. So to give you, and I wanted to just put this slide in, this is just really a pointer because I know that many of you are looking at how can incentives help with either at the consumer level or the business level. And so I want to just have these 2 pointers to Plug-in America's incentive database and also the US DOE Alternate Fuel Data Center. And you can go look in any individual state, you can see whether or not, for example, there are available incentives for charging infrastructure that you might want to put in with your business. So that's really the pointer there. I also wanted to, Richard already highlighted what was going on in terms of charging, but at the end of September, the Governor of California signed 6 EV-related bills. And to give you a feeling of the policy landscape on this, it included extension of HOV stickers, which are probably the best non-monetary incentive that can be provided to a consumer. It also provided over the next a few years programs that will allow for significant addition of infrastructure and development of renewable fuel and vehicle technology in California. We also started the beginning, I would say, of getting looking at charging infrastructure as part of the California Building Code and particularly the green building standards, and extending California's own rebate program. But the bill that we're going to talk about most today, and I'm going to try and give an overview, and again, like I said, Richard has done a great job of giving you a quick overview, was SB 454, which allows open access. And as Richard said very well, basically any driver can drive up to any charging station and be able to charge and know that that's going to work and that they're going to be able to find out what the pricing is and be able to find the station in the first place. So those are really the key things. And then, as I said, I'll mention some additional provisions as well. So again, really the core idea behind this is to create a set of basic regulations, sort of almost like a floor, that allow consumers to gain confidence around that they're going to be able to get access to public charging. And it really is focused on public charging, so workplace and multi-user dwellings, things that are sort of behind a gate or would not be included. It's really the market where individuals are paying for charging in public. There's quite a few situations where there's free charging today. Those are not covered by SB 454. Things like Tesla's superchargers not covered by SB 454 because they're not charging on an individual per session basis for that. And again, the idea is really that you don't have to be a member of a club. And it's really a little bit more like the gas station model, that you would never sort of pull into a gas station without knowing that you could see that it was available to you and that you could fuel your vehicle, and at the same time you would also know what the pricing is. And so we really saw this as a baseline for consumer acceptance, and the EVSPs, the charging companies, have done a great job as they started looking at this, at the bill and then the law, of making sure that compliance was straightforward. And for example, ChargePoint, I think, going in really actually was meeting all of the standards of the law in the first place. And so I think that really that's a testament. And what we really want to do is make it uniform across the industry. Some additional provisions relative to this were that companies would be providing the location, so that again, all of the data went to a standard database which is held by the Department of Energy at the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL. And they have a master database of where all the charging stations are. So that's just one of the requirements, is basically as you're at a public charging station, you include it in this database. It's a very simple submission process. Obviously, one of the key issues was this concept around interoperability for standards on billing for charging. So really the idea of this is it's much like cell phone roaming. And again, as Richard and John have both mentioned, there are a lot of efforts underway in the industry. So the idea was not to create a new bureaucracy around this, but to encourage the rapid adoption of those standards. And so basically, in fact, the state of California can't actually act on pushing any of those standards until after the beginning of 2015, and the law specifically says that it's encouraged to then adopt whatever industry or governmental standards have been developed. So the idea on this was really to give the industry just a little push on what they were already doing. And we see a variety of different potential solutions, ranging from things like collaborative to OCPP and the Open ChargePoint protocol. So there are various ways to achieve this kind of interoperability. And then of course the standards that NIST is working on also play very well into that. And finally, there was a part of the bill that was dropped, but there was originally a consumer complaint line, because we've been hearing a lot of issues and getting, basically feedback from drivers saying, well, I can't get access, the station's down, or the like. But what we've seen is really a great job done by the industry to kind of step up and make sure that their customer service efforts are able to not only enable the station, but also if there's a problem, handle that problem. So finally, one of the questions that, as Paul and Trevor were putting together this webinar, they also wanted to know a little bit, as this moves forward and starts to be adopted across the country, what was going on in terms of where were the conflicts and how did it resolve? And I have to say that I think that, again, the industry did a very good job of working with consumers. Initially, Plug in America had no intention of being in conflict with the industry by promoting this particular bill and then letting it become law. But there were a number of issues that turned out to be resolvable. Things like property rights, signage requirements. We're very, very big on making sure that you can actually find the charging station when you get to a garage, or located on a city block, depending on how you're trying to do it. And we found that there was definitely a gap. Unlike gas stations, where it's very, very obvious where the gas stations are, sometimes it's hard to find for a consumer. So we wanted to make sure that those kinds of things were resolved. Retrofit costs, mapping, consumer complaints. We also there was a big question about, were we creating unnecessary bureaucracy versus inspiring consumer confidence so that the whole industry would grow on that basis. And so Senator Ellen Corbett, whose bill this was, she met with all the stakeholders, and really, once everybody got in the room, within 90 minutes, I think we had pretty much a good resolution on all the outstanding issues, and SB 454 was able to move forward. And so as we move forward and as we see this roll out, both at the state level and potentially even at the federal level, we think it's going to inspire consumer confidence so that any individual EV driver knows that they'll be able to get the charging that they need in public, and really help create a larger market. So that's my quick overview, and I think we hand it back to Trevor and John for questions.
Thanks, Jay. We've got a number of questions that have come in. The first one we'll start with is, what are some EV charging business models that can be deployed that allow for interoperability today?
I'll pick that up to start. This is Richard Lowenthal. So I think all of the providers today actually have the provisions of 454, SB 454 with regard to open access. For example, on the Blink network and on our network, we put a toll-free number on every station, and if you call that number, then the guy on the other end can start a session for you at that station. So today it can be done that way. It can be done by credit cards. We accept the contactless credit cards at our stations, and so that's a completely anonymous transaction where it doesn't matter what network you're on. It does, until we have, though, collaborative in place and roaming, you have some limited functionality. For instance, today, if you're on one of these networks, you can get a notification when your charging is done so that somebody else can use your space and things like that. So we do think people will value being connected to one of these networks, and that's why we continue to work on collaborative, so we can bring you all the benefits of networking in a roaming environment.
Thanks, Richard.
So there's also interoperability from the hardware perspective, and I think we're a little more early in that respect, so I think that's sort of a process to develop over time.
Thanks, John. Another question we had was, how are the fees established for collaborative and other interconnectors in this, I guess, roaming marketplace? Is it free market, or is there some sort of state or possibly federal regulation that will come into play?
So the regulation on that, also established both by SB 454 and by NIST Handbook 130, is that all fees have to be disclosed. So the driver, similar to what happens at the ATM machine, so the driver will have a chance to say, no, I don't feel like paying that fee, before he commits. It looks like what's going to happen is if you're a member at the station you're sitting in front of, then there'll be no fee at all because you're not really roaming. When there is a fee because you're crossing networks, that is, your account is on one network and the station you're sitting in front of is at another network, those fees will be established by the members of Collaborative. So I think it's looking like probably 5 different network members will get together and establish a fair rate.
Another question is, under SB 454, is an employer providing EVSE for its employees considered public? What if the EVSE can be used by guests and visitors of that office/workplace?
So I'll weigh in here, but probably Jay wants to too. You want to go first, Jay?
No. Go ahead, Richard.
So there's another question here that's related, which is was why did ChargePoint at first oppose 454 and then end up supporting it? And it's primarily this issue. So language that was inserted later into the bill, which we thought was just excellent language, was where the owner of the station determines whether it's available to the public or not. So it is up to the station owner and the property owner to say, this one is available to the public, this one is not. Once they say it's available to the public, it has to follow the rules of Senate Bill 454 and has to be in the NREL database and all of that.
And I think Richard summed it up very well. The one thing that I think that again, I think this was one of those things we didn't want to, what we would like to see is the most widely available possible public charging network. However, there are absolutely situations where you want to have, for example, workplace charging where it's not generally available to the public. And so, again, as Richard said, I think it was a well-done compromise to really make that something that the owner or the landlord of the property could decide whether or not they were making public charging available or not. And then you follow the rules if you're making it available to the public. One of the other questions I think that came through, and just to add on, was are non-networked chargers that charge subject to the rules of 454. And again, under the key provisions, really, as long as it's available, open access, and that you can charge with a credit card, and that you display your pricing, then those are really the primary rules there, and you would not be subject to the interoperability provisions if it's not a networked charger.
Thanks, Jay. Is there support to push SB 454 up to the federal level in the near future, or is this something that you all believe will happen state by state?
Well, from our perspective, we've definitely had some interest at the federal level. There are a couple of very strong EV proponents, actually both on in the House and in the Senate at the in U.S. Congress, and so we've definitely gotten some interest in looking at open access at the federal level. Right now, I would say most of the activity is really going on in the states as individual states start enacting EV supporting laws. So I think anyone might be able to guess how much can get done at the federal level at the moment, but I think that we are seeing a definite interest both at the state and the federal level in terms of propagating this across the country.
Thanks, Jay. Another question came in. What's the relationship between the EPRI rules that John mentioned and what state legislatures might do, and how do those two pieces fit together?
So first of all, they're not EPRI rules, they're NIST. It's NIST, and they're not really rules. So NIST has charge at the federal level to try and develop model language, and I guess the idea is they don't have the right to set rules in states, but they can generate model language at the federal level. States, weights and measures bodies evaluate that language and can choose to adopt it as is into state law, or they can choose to adopt it in amended form. And so this gets published on an annual basis. There's a national weights and measures meeting that reviews all these changes to the various weights and measures rules. Probably the biggest change here is that in most states, I think California is the only exception, electricity has always traditionally been metered and sold through utilities. And so this moves the testing and vetting and calibration and certification of metering for vehicle fueling to a weights and measures function. So a lot of states, that doesn't happen now. Their weights and measures department has no connection with electricity. So that's a major change. I think there was a related question to that as well on the NIST, that it does go to the state level, but it's totally up to the states to adopt the language, to ignore the language, and it can be, it could be contradictory to state law, and then I think it comes down to what the state decides to do, and that's always a danger in our system in the U.S., where states do have the right to set their own law.
Thanks, John.
I guess, and this is Jay, I guess the only thing I would also add to that is there's also different, whether or not this gets picked up by state legislatures, by state regulatory agencies. I think in individual states, each state, for example, in California, the Public Utilities Commission had was the primary driver. But as Richard mentioned with AB 631, what happened was there was clearly a move to have the legislature sort of codify that and make it law. And I think that there are a number of states that are looking at that. Richard might know more the exact number of states that have adopted that particular provision.
Yeah, it's 13 states now that have, what they adopted was something similar to Assembly Bill 631, saying that if you are offering charging services, that by itself does not make you a utility, and in most places, then that would make you subject to local weights and measures laws. Then the weights and measures piece is they publish this Handbook 130 and Handbook 44. The states choose to adopt those or adopt modified versions or not adopt them, but frankly, it's a trend that's moving across the states, and I think in nowhere have people said we're going to go in a different direction. I think in a number of places they haven't adopted these provisions, basically the provisions of Handbook 130, but it is it feels like it's going to be very widespread.
Thanks, Richard. We've got another question about roaming, and when does that look like it's going to be integrated into the electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and what should property owners be doing in the meantime?
So there are two pieces here of interoperability. So maybe I should provide a little bit of clarity. What we call roaming, which is really kind of driver roaming, doesn't affect the property owner. It affects the driver and the ease with which that they can operate a public charging station. So the property owner really doesn't have to concern themselves much with that piece. And with that piece, this is the piece that would be done by collaborative, and the timing is being set by SB 454 really, which says that for public charging you need to adopt something by the beginning of 2015. You need to implement it by the end of 2015. I think most players are going to be done with that sooner than that. But so the latest really by that time would be the end of 2015 that we'll have driver roaming.
And I would just throw in that if acceptance of credit cards is widespread, that gives you sort of initial driver roaming capability. But I guess Richard's referring to roaming across. If you belong to one network, you could easily use other providers.
That's correct.
Right, but as John just said, I mean the sort of baseline driver roaming, basically the open access is the ability to just use your credit card. So we think that that's sort of again the baseline. But the concept of actual roaming between the various networks is clearly a nice benefit for consumers.
Thanks, Jay. I've got a question for you. Did you initially think that SB 454 might end up hurting EV drivers by reducing the amount of available charging?
This was one of the great questions that we discussed and debated as part of SB 454. And one of the things I want to do is give it a sort of a larger perspective for a minute. You have to remember, I mean, as John's slide showed, most of the charging happens, at home. I mean, in fact, really, the way to think of it is EV charging happens where cars sleep. So where are they sleeping for a long period of time? And so it's really at home, then it's at your workplace, and then it's out in the public. And so what we really wanted to do, we felt that it was much, much more important to make sure, based on the number of complaints that we were getting, that everybody could get access to every station, because in essence, many of the drivers felt like they were already prohibited from using some number of the stations. So we really felt that by creating, again, this very stable baseline, which most of the EVSPs were already meeting, really gave us that big leverage, and the consumer confidence would drive the purchase of more cars would drive more charging. So, but to really circle back, I mean, I think that there is a real big, if you look at the whole landscape, a third of Nissan Leaf owners still charge on level 1. So if you start to think about that, there are all kinds of solutions, again, at the residential level, at the workplace level, even in public, where you're at airport parking lots, and level 1 would make sense. Or look at level 3, or as John correctly noted, DC fast charging. All of these solutions, there's a really wide variety of market options. Right now, the sweet spot seems to be around level 2, but I think that there is sort of a broader marketplace of both charging and of ideas and of business models around charging.
Thanks, Jay. Another question here is, what are the lessons of the Blink and a Better Choice failures, and how does this legislation and the issue of interoperability protect property owners against that in the future and the EV marketplace in general?
Well, I imagine we have potentially different views on this, but this is Richard Lowenthal with ChargePoint. So the good news is that that all of the stations that put out by those companies are still in operation today and never went through a period of non-operation. And so kind of the market worked. In the case of the Better Place chargers, a company called OffConnect picked those up and continued to support them. In the case of Blink, a company called car charging picked those up and continues to operate them. So there was no negative impact to property owners. So that's the good news. We definitely need protections for that, and I think all of our companies have moved toward this open charge point protocol, so that if something were to happen like that, then you'd have other options for operating the station. So nobody wants the kind of stranded asset problem of a charging station there that doesn't work because of something wrong with the company that's behind it. So we've all moved to adopt OCPP so that the station owner never has to worry about the prospect of their station not being usable in the future.
I would just
yeah, and I'll just
go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry, John. Well, I was just going to add, I think that one of the great things that came out of a session at the California Energy Commission where Craig Childers from ARB suggested this concept of basically, again, having a baseline charger capability that sort of defaulted back to OCPP, so that if chargers, if a company went out of business, there was the ability for another company to acquire those assets and get them, quickly back up and running on whatever network was appropriate. So I think that seeing the industry rally behind that suggestion from the late Craig Childers, I think was a really, really beneficial thing, and I think it means, it's a good thing for consumers.
And then I would just point out to those of you that procure charging infrastructure, just be sure to ask that question. What happens if the network is down? What happens if the company goes away? What are my options a year from now if you have a contract, to use another provider? Just, upfront questions like that are really helpful to understand what you're purchasing.
We've got somebody on the line here who runs an off-airport parking facility with level 2 chargers, and they provide free charging to their customers. Under this new law, will they have to allow individuals off the street to access the chargers?
Again, that's up to them. If they declare them public stations and they want to get basically revenue from the public to come in and charge at those stations, then they need to follow the guidelines and law of Senate Bill 454. But if they don't declare them public, if they say that that's one of their resources for their private facility, they're not subject to these rules. They are subject, if a consumer is able to go up to one of those chargers and pay at it like a point of sale, they will be subject to Handbook 130. So anytime the public is allowed to go up to a station, pay money for charging services, they will be subject to the regulations of weights and measures and typically Handbook 130.
Thanks, Richard. We're about out of time here, so I've got one more question I want to open up to all the presenters. What do you think the charging infrastructure will look like 5 years from today in the United States?
So I'll take a quick stab at it. This is Richard again. We see it growing pretty rapidly. At this point, ChargePoint's business, 60% of our business is growth business. So where there are chargers, people start bringing their cars there. The charging stations get used up, and the property owner or business owner deploys more. So we're going to see a lot of growth where things have started. The counterpoint to that is where infrastructure hasn't been deployed. Cars are going to come a lot later, and so I think we'll probably have to take proactive action to be sure that places that are a little later to this game grow at the rate of the early adopter.
I'll throw out a comment that I heard from one of the auto manufacturers, which was they felt like there's only so many consumers they can reach if the infrastructure stayed the same as it is today. There's a finite limit to the number of consumers that would adopt plug-in vehicles, and that to exceed that, they've got to have a more ubiquitous infrastructure in the U.S. So you've seen some of the automotive manufacturers actually stepping in and taking a very proactive role in helping get the infrastructure out there. I think order to get more wide consumer adoption, you have to have a more robust system. Some of that's just the availability of it makes people consider the vehicle. So there's a potential that you build out the infrastructure and it doesn't get used a lot, but it's the confidence factor that helps sell the cars.
And I'll add. I think I mean, for anyone who's seen, there's a little device called the Belkin Wemo, which is basically a 120-volt outlet that you can control with your iPhone or Android phone. I think that what we're going to see is a variety of different sort of magically networked Internet of Things kind of connected devices and power outlets. And whether those outlets are level 1, level 2, DC quick charges, I think that we'll see, for example, valet service amenities charging you very, very quickly in a parking area, and I think you'll see walls of level 1 and level 2 chargers available. And what will happen is people will deploy based on cost and based on availability and based on driver requests. So I think you'll see a very mixed world out there that's potentially everything from direct paid to advertising sponsored.
Well, thank you all for presenting today, and that's all the time we have for questions. The information that you've shared with us has helped us as an industry to gain a greater understanding of EV access and its importance in installing EV charging infrastructure. As of tomorrow morning, this presentation, as well as our panelists' contact information, will be available on the Green Parking Council website. I encourage you to reach out to John, Richard, or Jay with any questions that were not answered today. In addition, please email me with any suggestions you may have for future webinars at trevor@greenparkingcouncil.org. Thanks for joining us.